Thank you, Tori. It is an honor to have the opportunity to facilitate an interview today with the Commissioner of the SEC. So first, I want to start by welcoming Commissioner Greg Sankey, just completing his 6th year as the Commissioner of the SEC, almost 20 years leading in various capacities for our organization. And I know it's been a long and strenuous year, but Commissioner, I can imagine the last couple of months and the opportunity to get out in front of folks again, engage with our student athletes, and hand out some hardware has been a rewarding and a long time coming experience for you.
It has, and I don't know when we're back to normal, if ever, but it has felt back towards normal has been my phrase. And so to finish a baseball tournament, which was our last conference sponsored competitive event with great crowd, and to do it in a healthy way was rewarding. Backing up to softball, it was kind of the first time I felt normal. Maybe in Nashville, the Alabama-Tennessee semifinal basketball matchup, there was enough emotion, even though we were only at 25%, that felt normal. So it's been a long journey, but at least hopeful that the fall will be back towards normal in an even greater way.
Well, we appreciate you taking some time today to visit with the Southeastern Conference Communicators Association as we facilitate a virtual conference. We hope to be back to normal next summer and meeting in person for our annual summer conferences. But again, it's a pleasure to be with you. I want to start by backing up about 10 or 11 months and thinking back to the summer of 2020 when the college football season was on the brink. Take us back to last summer and describe what it was like to be navigating all of those issues that were hitting you from all angles, working with our campus leaders and medical advisors, and looking for a way to preserve the college football season. At that time, many other conference leaders were beginning to signal defeat, wave the white flag, perhaps punt to the spring or beyond. And you were in many ways credited with saving the college football season. What was that experience like, and what were some of the major takeaways for you in trying to get us to a September kickoff and have a college football season?
I think it starts with we never stopped trying, and of anything that I might be credited for doing or achieving, I'd simply go back and just observe we never stopped trying, and that produced a set of results. If you go back, I've actually spent since March time on a regular basis reflecting on what was happening a year ago on a particular date. June 8th for us was when we finally opened back up our weight rooms, and really a 3-month time period from mid-March until early mid-June where everybody was scattered. And then we had to figure out how to come back. And once we started June 8th, the question just mounted. It was almost a month later in early July, right around July 8th or 9th, where, the Ivy League said, we're not going to play anything in the fall. The Big Ten said, we're going to play a conference only schedule. And it was that next weekend after some of those announcements. In fact, Stanford had announced the elimination of, I think, 11 of its varsity sports. I spent a lot of time that weekend on the phone with our presidents and chancellor, just asking how they saw the fall playing out, the return to classes, what was going to happen in their locales, what they'd done to prepare in a pandemic to conduct residential life again. And then at the end, what do you think about us supporting athletic competition? And what I learned was there was a great deal of patience on the part of our campus leadership. That was going to allow us to be patient as well. We didn't have to rush to decisions. And when I was approached probably in early August about, hey, a couple of conferences don't think we're going to be able to play, can we all shut down together? I said, I'm a few weeks from making that decision. And those were really important weeks to allow us to finalize a testing plan. We reset our schedule. We slowed down, respecting the return to campus. I think what gets lost in this football dominant culture is we set a new start date. It was September 26th for the first games of the season based on our campus's opening dates. In other words, we knew the importance of our campuses opening, returning to, again, residential life, to conducting classes, even though much was done virtually, and then letting that settle out. We were familiar with this 3-week lag of COVID positivity rates. And that played out. Some others started earlier. What we did that was unique, I think, among all college and professional leagues, was once we started with football, we avoided disruption for the first 3 weeks of play. And that goes back really to the question about how we made decisions with our medical advisory task force, involving experts even outside the conference to talk through, myocarditis, and really not respond to what was in the press, but try to learn the science behind the COVID infection and what it meant big picture. How do we quarantine? How do we isolate? How do we support healthy competition? And a lot of moving parts there, which goes back to we just never stopped trying. And the answers, we were able to see those emerge just by taking as much time to make informed decisions as possible.
So many of those decisions there really was no playbook for, and you had a lot of folks giving you a lot of unsolicited opinions or ideas or suggestions on what decisions were the right decisions to make. I'm curious to learn from you in situations like that, and you've had many of them over the course of the last year and a half. What do you do when you're not sure what you should do? What are the steps that you go through in that decision-making process to try to arrive at the best decision?
A few years ago, I read a book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, who's a professional poker player. And it began with an analysis of an NFL Super Bowl game. It was the Patriots and the Seahawks. Seattle had the ball and threw a pass that was intercepted at the end of the game on the 1 yard line. And a lot of debate about, what's the right call. And in the book, in the opening of the book, she walks through, percentages, and you're going to have to make judgments. And one of the things I observed really early on is I had been advised by a biostatistician from the University of South Carolina, Stella South. This was in mid-April. She said, look, this is all new. If you think back 30 days, and we were 30 days from shutting down, and then think forward 30 days, when you think back to and compare to today, how much more you know about managing COVID, just play that out, and the growth of knowledge will accelerate. And that was the information about taking time to make decisions. And so that became a mantra. And then as I tried to frame the decision making or shape the decision making process, we had a calendar of events where we knew we'd make decisions or need to make decisions around certain periods of time. But it was followed by this: we're going to have more data, but it won't be complete. And so we're going to have to use judgment, which takes me back to that book, observing you had to cut through the clutter, figure out where the data was helpful, but understand you were going to have to make judgment decisions. And it wasn't everybody else's judgment. It wasn't the circumstance in this conference, which when other people made decisions, my observation was that was informative for us, not determinative. And I think those statements in retrospect were actually really well informed by a lot of counsel, that ability to make decisions in the right time frame, not on somebody else's time frame, are all representative of the answer to your question, which was you had to move beyond the clutter. You had to know what was going on around you, but then focus back on how do we make the best informed, appropriate decisions for the Southeastern Conference and our member campuses, recognizing there wasn't going to be some magical statistic that guided you to this non-debatable answer. You're going to have to use the best judgment. And then once you made the judgment, live with the outcomes. People were going to criticize, they were going to be happy. But at the end of the day, you had to make a decision with a clear understanding you were going to be evaluated based on that decision. You may have to adjust, and you better be comfortable with those outcomes.
You have a very unique role. You're both at the top of the hierarchy in decision making for our conference, but you also have 14 bosses in a way in the presidents of the SEC institutions. I know sometimes when it's time to make a decision, you take a vote in a room, and at other times it's up to you to make a judgment call. So how do you maintain trust in situations like that when consensus may not even be possible?
I'd start with communication. And so one of the realities, and I could probably reference any number of books in answering this question or any or all of the questions this morning. So I read a book written by a Navy SEAL team leader who made an observation actually about when John Heisman coached at Auburn University in the late 1800s and had a hurry up offense. And he used that in a military setting to define the need to adapt one's operating rhythm to the circumstances. And going back to football, he said a hurry up offense is just about operating rhythm and is trying to make the opponent adapt to your operating rhythm. And again, he analogized that to a military setting. When we shut down, our meeting schedule evaporated. Our plans for a spring meeting and kind of making annual big decisions were gone. And so we had to adapt our operating rhythm, which was based on communication. And I'm going to be imperfect about communication, but we made the best efforts to accelerate the frequency of communication with key leadership groups, particularly our presidents and chancellors, and then our athletics directors. So those leading our campuses and those leading our athletics departments knew what was happening in real time. And it was an enormous time commitment. You know, we had over 40 video conferences starting in early April through the end of the year. And I actually totaled up the time, and it meant that our presidents had to commit directly to conference governance probably 50 or 60 hours of the year, which is essentially one of the 52 weeks, which is a lot of time because of the pressures they had taking place. Yet the ability to maintain confidence and trust and make some decisions, even when they were split decisions, I think was based on that communication cycle changing and adapting to the operating environment.
And reflecting on that, do you think that will change the way that you communicate and engage with the presidents and other SEC leaders moving forward post-pandemic?
I do. I'm often asked, you know, what do you take away from this experience that will continue to be used moving forward? And usually it's the sports media who asks that question of me. And what they want me to say is, we're going to play 10 SEC versus SEC football games every year. Or, hey, we know we can change a football game on Monday and then play it on Saturday. That latter one I don't ever want to do again, by the way. And the former is really not in our strategic planning or strategic thinking. I call it strategic thinking, not strategic planning. I do think, though, the communication strategies and timeliness is an adaptation that will continue. We're going to have to find, you know, the pendulum always swings. So as soon as we shut down, we had to ramp up, and we figured out in about a week or two, we better ramp up the frequency of communication. So the pendulum swung to, let's meet daily with athletics directors and weekly with presidents and chancellors. And now it's moved back to weekly with athletics directors and bi-weekly with presidents and chancellors. And we'll try to figure out the right, again, operating rhythm. There's just so much happening right now in college athletics. I don't think we have the luxury to go back. You know, presidents and chancellors met 3 times a year, maybe one specially called meeting. I think this enhanced pace will be upon us for, you know, some period of time.
What about the workplace dynamics? I know your staff, like a lot of ours, had to grapple with working remotely, perhaps hybrid setups at different times. Now you may have folks trickling back into the office on a more regular basis. Any lessons learned from those dynamics that you might carry forward as well?
Yeah, a few. First, Monday, March 16th, we were actually back in the office. We had stopped what was happening around athletic competition on the 12th. So that was Thursday. On 13th, we stopped practices. But at that time, we thought forward 3 weeks, because that was kind of the time period for these variances, we thought, in COVID testing. So we projected out to late March, the idea that maybe we could regather, engage in some kind of spring sport competition, you know, baseball, softball, golf. And over the weekend, it became clear that was not going to happen. And then on March 16th, we were in the office, probably 20 of our 40 staff. And at the end of the day, or during the day, our local health department said, you know, kind of shut down, you know, go to work remote, you know, we need to stop the spread. So we pulled everybody together and said, okay, take your laptops home, We're going to be working remotely, even though we don't know what working remotely really means. And then by the next morning, we had a memo out to describe that. We opened up actually mid-May, so we had 2 months of everybody dispersed, and then gathered back May 18th with probably a quarter of our staff all scheduled, mass social distancing. We had proximity trackers by Connexon. Our teams wore these through the year. So we were doing the same kind of things that were happening within our athletics programs. And then we expanded in January our staff. So we've had as much as probably 2/3 of our 40 in on certain days. We just removed the masking component, which leads to this. I think we were effective during the remote work experience. In some ways, very effective. Maybe not for everyone on a 40-member staff, but certainly some real heroes of remote work. Most of our senior leadership team has been in the office since the first of the year on a frequent basis, but I don't think we were as effective as we can be. You know, the hallway conversations, the ideas that just pop up and are part of dialogue. We're going to have to remember that it probably, I would expect, won't be the same. I haven't defined that for our staff. We're projecting, doors wide open come July 7th. But even then, a bit more flexibility yet. I'm one who thinks there's value in gathering. And I think we have to respect that reality. Just like there's value in residential learning around college campuses, some of it's really intangible. There's value in gathering as a workforce and sharing ideas, meeting. And I think for the esprit de corps, that's true. But I also think for the effectiveness of the organization, that's true.
I want to switch gears for just a minute and talk about another front burner issue for you over the course of the past year, and that's name, image, and likeness. I know you've had to speak about this at length many times. There are a lot of different components, but to drill down a little bit to the communications folks that are part of our audience today, as you envision the future, which is just a few weeks away now in terms of the implementation of name, image, and likeness for our student athletes, how do you see the role of our communications professionals on our campuses and our athletic departments evolving with this shift? And will it affect the way that we promote our student athletes both on and off the field?
The ability to answer that question is going to be defined by the laws and rules in place that actualize or activate actual name, image, and likeness economic activity. Will there be an impact? Yes. But that impact will be different if Congress acts and we have one national standard across the country based on a federal law. It would be then again different in 11 states in the SEC footprint if there are 11 state laws not preempted by federal legislation. And will be different yet again if there are varying state laws, some that have state legislation, some that don't, and we have an NCA rule that then pulls back and permits name, image, and likeness activity to happen among student athletes. Right now, this is going to be individually driven activities. You're going to have these individual business units, if you will, student athletes engaging in and promoting and selling their name, image, and likeness, whether it's through sponsoring a camp, which will have an impact if it's being sponsored by a local business or even a national business, that will have an impact. And I roll back to last year where you had student athletes engaged in social justice, racial equality, if you will, demonstrations, rallies, protests, depending on what label one would use. That came back to how you communicate, how you respond, how you describe that activity. Now add to that, they're living their lives, they're being young people taking stands with these economic activities that may be tied back into the local community. I think that has enormous implications for how we will communicate. People will be asking questions in a different way. Young people may have the ability to affiliate with businesses that may be other than those sponsoring an athletic program, or to a certain extent, depending on the laws in place, that may raise eyebrows, if you will. I'll say that in a friendly way, from a social perspective. So absolutely, there's going to be different elements from a communication and a public relations standpoint. The question that has to be answered is what's going to be the regulatory framework in which we operate. And so to fully answer the question is we're going to fall short right now because we cannot make all of those determinations until we know what statutes and what regulations are going to be in place.
How long do you envision? I know I'm asking you to get your crystal ball out, but how long do you envision it will be before we have any clarity around those issues? Is this something that could get cleared up in the next few months? Is it 6 months? Is it a year down the road before we have some alignment and clarity on these issues?
On July 1st, we're going to have state laws in effect. So the earliest kind of boundary line is July 1st. There will be economic activity around name, image, and likeness. Then there are state laws that go into effect in August, some in January of 2022. And then right now, I think the latest new state law that would then come into effect is July of 2023. So there's a window of uncertainty. How about we define it that way? And you can imagine between July 1 of 2021 and July 1 of 2023, a lot of state activity. The NCAA is going to be trying to figure out how to manage its rules. And then when may Congress weigh in? So we're still in the conversations with congressional representatives seeking that common template for activation of name, image, and likeness. It seems unlikely you're going to have a law adopted and signed by July 1st at the congressional level. And so you're going to enter that 2-year period of uncertainty, wondering, is it possible to have something that creates a common approach? If I had an answer to how I could provide that clarity, ultimately I would. What I can do is provide clarity around what exists, what opportunities there are to affect, if you will, a national standard, and then acknowledge that just like the last 15 months and the uncertainty around a virus that emerged among us, we're going to be dealing in a different way with a level of uncertainty about how do we manage name, image, and likeness issues. But that's going to be layered on transfer issues, probably something we haven't even imagined yet. And when I speak of that continuing adaptation to the operating rhythm, these issues inform the need to have a more frequent point of communication with our campus and athletics department leaders.
All right, thank you for that. I want to switch gears now to a little more of a light, more fun topic, and that's branding and marketing opportunities, particularly with the SEC. You've been very involved in the past in the development and implementation of the SEC's It Just Means More branding campaign. I believe it's the first of its kind. Talk to us about what's on the horizon for the conference in terms of marketing initiatives and maybe the evolution of the It Just Means More campaign moving forward.
In a moment of honesty, as we record this, I'm 2 days from our baseball tournament championship. And so I took Memorial Day to catch my breath, and then we're on to next year. So we have focused on kind of operational aspects. And then there are a set of just big picture issues, the name, image, and likeness issue. There's a Supreme Court decision, the transfer issue, dealing with the financial issues post-pandemic. That being said, we've worked through, we've used the Richards Group as our agency of record for the It Just Means More campaign. It's important for a couple of reasons. When I took over in my presentation to our presidents and chancellors during the interview process, the conference had never funded, if you will, a marketing campaign. We had never gone to an agency and asked, how can we present ourselves more effectively? What we had done is simply, we took our broadcast partners, and in our contracts, they produced what we called hoisting videos, which you lifted a bunch of trophies. That's what we always showed. And it's not like it's a secret that we win a lot. So we wanted to show something more. That will continue. There's actually been a change in leadership among the Richards Group. Stan Richards had stepped down, some comments in the fall that created a level of turmoil that weren't representative of certainly our expectations. We actually took a pause with our agency as they needed to look at who they are, define their expectations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and move forward. And so we've re-engaged with our team. We'll continue with the Richards Group. We want to make sure they fulfill their commitments and how they support our campaign, but also how they continue to adapt as an agency. So that's point one. Point two, the It Just Means More theme will continue. What you did see was an adaptation last year that goes back to the 50th anniversary of integration of the league in 2017, where we added the word together. And as we tried to identify what could we do in a unifying way, given the racial equality issues that have been identified, have always been there, but emerged on the front page, the activity of our student athletes and our campus leaders and our coaches around racial equality. We took an approach that all of our messaging last year would be around together. It just means more. And again, that goes back to integration. And there was this great 1-minute feature that we produced, because you don't have a lot of time to communicate within football games, back in 2017, telling the story of Nate Northington and his teammates in football at the University of Kentucky, and Perry Wallace and Godfrey Dillard, 2 teammates at Vanderbilt University. Those were the first African Americans in football and men's basketball to play at a varsity level. And so we're going to carry that forward. And I think what you'll see is a celebration of return to what makes us special, the atmosphere, the feeling, the emotion around the SEC, but also respect that these issues in our culture are not simply going away. And I've not seen the prospective messaging ideas for next fall, but those should be coming to me rapidly.
We look forward to that. In terms of the work that we're responsible for on our campuses, student recruitment, marketing, and promotion of our various institutions, how do you think the conference can best support the messaging and the academic aspirations of the member institutions? What value beyond just the It Just Means More campaign can the conference add to the work that we're doing?
And this is one of those additive opportunities, and one that we've spent more time discussing. So we've had an effort at academic collaboration that's existed since the early 2000s, originally called the SEC Academic Consortium, then SECU, and now we label it SEC Academic Relations, really as a core function of who we are as a league. And that activation has focused more on what's happening around our campuses, less about athletics, although we're not going to run away from what we do. We are a conference focused on athletic competition, but how can we add value for our campuses? And so the campaigns around Time Magazine, Fortune, Chronicle of Higher Education, to target the higher education community in an intentional way with communications about what's happening among our campuses, be it research, be it academic achievement. We've just gone through our Professor of the Year process to elevate attention around what's happening on our campuses, both from teaching and research, but also the service component. That's become enormously important. And I think we've done that in a healthy way. The creation of admissions tours involving all 14 of our campuses is representative of each of you are going to make decisions on your own campuses about how you present yourselves. And then how can we engage among a collection of 14 universities? It's not just 14 football teams or 14 athletics programs. This is an organization of 14 universities. How can we then bring value to desired collaboration? And we've probably had fits and starts around that, like the shared library holdings was a great idea, didn't work so well. Long time ago, our colleagues in the Big Ten created an academic consortium, so they're engaged in shared purchasing. That's not really going to do much from a marketing standpoint. It does create efficiencies, but that's not something that really works for us. And so we've tried to figure out how can we message, and that's where our engagement with some of our communications professionals has been really important and will be moving forward.
Well, it's a great opportunity for me to give a shout out to Tori Johnson and the great job that she does. Much like your role with the presidents this past year, we've had an opportunity to engage more regularly as vice presidents of communications on the various campuses, and working with Tori more regularly. There's been a really healthy dialogue, and I think we're all really excited about the momentum we have moving forward for better integration and support for one another in those efforts moving forward. So thank you for that. And thank you to Tori for her leadership as well. I want to talk a little bit more on that same subject as it relates to on our campuses. Today, as part of our SECCA audience, you have both campus and athletics communications folks represented on the call. From your perspective, what are some ways that you'd like to see us have better integration of our promotional efforts of the holistic student athlete storytelling that we do, the links between academics and athletics, ways that our university and athletic department communicators can better work together to tell those stories and collaborate to elevate the entire student athlete experience on our campuses?
To me, it begins with the recognition of the need to do what you just described, which is to create that link and tell those stories around our student athletes. The basis for my observation is there's an incomplete narrative that exists. And so you can hear about false narratives and this narrative. It's incomplete. So fundamentally, I think we do things really, really well in college athletics. We bring people into our campuses. You know, we're pressured. We need to know the football schedule so we can schedule homecoming so people can return. We need to know Parents' Day opportunities. We need to know these different dates for football games, or then when we go into basketball season, so we can create these other activities around what happens in a stadium or an arena. That's really important to who we are. It's not as if we're just divorced from campus. Yeah, there are always going to be tensions, but we're not just divorced from campus. And we feature our universities, the names on the front of the jersey, the scoreboard, the success, all of those things, again, are in this additive component. But the narrative that's uninformed is we bring people in, we exploit them, they're not educated, they're cast aside, and we don't maintain lifelong connections with our student athletes like happens with our students on campus. I think that's incomplete. I won't use the word false because there's probably a story or two that accurately would portray some of those realities. Well, we all know that happens on campus too. You know, people come to campus, they have high expectations, and after a semester, it didn't work out. After a year, they decide to go someplace else. They never come back. Some spend 4 years, graduate, earn a degree, and hey, they've got the degree, but there's no real attachment. That's just life, you know. That's higher education. What we can do though is for the predominant reality, which is the successes, the creation of lifelong memories. I had a young football player playing in the NFL. I bumped into him on campus when I was on a visit during the NFL season. On a Monday night, he had played on Sunday, didn't have to be back to Tuesday. He was walking the hallways of one of our athletics departments. They said, well, what brings you here? Because this wasn't like close to where he's playing in the NFL. He said, well, this is home for me. We have to tell those stories intentionally. And I'll use another descriptor, aggressively, because the incomplete narrative is what I described, that there aren't lifelong attachments, that people are cast aside, that they're not educated. And I think those of us embedded in it know that that's not reality. Yep, there are pressures around athletic performance. There are tensions between commitment of time athletically and academically. And one of my big concerns in this name, image, and likeness activity is if our student athletes are telling us about time demands between athletics and academics, when you add the third component, which is this personal economic activity, from where does that time come in their schedule? And that's a threat, probably not to their athletic performance, but to their academic achievement. And so it's going to make more important the ability to say, hey, we actually form lifelong relationships with our student athletes. They do have meaningful academic success. Their education is the kind of which we're proud to put a graduate patch on their uniform and to have them go into the world as next generation leaders. Whatever can be done by our campuses to tell that story, and whatever we can do to help integrate that message, I think is enormously important. So before there was It Just Means More, my vision was, and I am the SEC campaign, and we've stuck our toe in the water. We haven't engaged an outside firm. Perhaps we pivot our tagline. And there's a risk in that. People tell their stories and then they go make poor decisions at some point in life. But a young person or an alum telling the story of how they got to be on your campus, the experiences they had, and where they are in life, I think has incredible meaning. And it's not just a student athlete, by the way. It's those who go on to be leaders in the real world. We've created on the SEC network, when we could gather together and bring in a production crew, a homecoming series where people like Tim Cook were a part of it, telling his story at Auburn University, Darius Rucker at the University of South Carolina, Maryland, Houston, University of Alabama, Titus O'Neil, University of Florida. I mean, these things go on, and we've got others that have been told and others that need to be told as we share the impact on lives being made on our campuses. And I've extended that beyond just our athletic experience into what we do with our student body, and how do we mesh those two so that it becomes a seamless presentation, not one that's siloed between athletics and, if you will, academics and the other part of campus life.
Those are great thoughts. And I know I speak for all of our institutions when I say thank you for the forward thinking and looking for ways to leverage a platform like the SEC network to do that storytelling, particularly the storytelling of some of those notable alums outside of the athletic arena, like the ones that you mentioned. Those have been really well received on our campuses and among our fan bases, and it's been fun to get to be a small part of those projects. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about social media. You are perhaps the most active commissioner on the social media platforms, Twitter in particular. Interested to hear from you what you feel like are some of the biggest advantages and disadvantages to communicating and engaging with a really broad audience via those platforms. And has your approach or thought process changed at all over the course of this last year and a half?
Yeah, that's a great question. So today, 6 years ago today, was my first day as commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, and we had a debate about my little Twitter account that had a couple thousand followers. It was focused on my daughter's marching band experiences and around high school football, and the quality of nachos at concession stands, and the number of tubas or sousaphones in the band, whether that would continue. And so the encouragement internally and then with some external experts, they said, you can make yourself more human through that vehicle, and knowing that there'd be the negativity. And I think what I've seen over the Twitter account is the level of negativity is magnified. I think it's a really fascinating place for discourse, but it's also a place where there's wallowing, we'll say, and blame. And so I'm actually going to spend some time this summer re-engaging with our staff and even outside experts, asking, is this really valuable? On the other hand, when the gyms closed, I started running. And so in my obsessive compulsive behavior, I've run 420 consecutive days, which was really mental therapy for me, not something I intended. But because of my Twitter account, I've actually been walking through places with people I've never met who say, hey, did you get your run in today? And I think that shows the positive opportunity that's there. And really the question is, how do we try to maintain a more positive flavor and ignore the wallowing, the negativity? And I'll just observe, when one thinks about mental wellness in this age of social media, some of the research I've read that tracks back to the just explosion of social media activities, and then the increase of mental wellness difficulties and challenges. Not that social media invented mental wellness challenges, but it's magnified because of the way people can attack and present within that environment. And one of the educational points has been to make sure we're constantly in conversation with student athletes in our campuses about what that means for young people, because I do think that's a bit of a threat and a reality we have to be sophisticated in considering, particularly around how we support young people given that environment.
From a practical standpoint, do you look at your mentions? Do you just completely ignore them? Are they a valuable listening tool at all, or what do you do with that data?
Yeah, on Saturdays in the fall, I close my eyes and I go to my mentions. I go to my mentions, then I close my eyes and I just flick up so that they're all, put aside. And then after a couple of days, when I've made it through another football Saturday and my self view, my self talk has become positive again, then I'll go back and look and figure out what everybody was angry about. Part of the value hypothetically is interaction, but not all interaction has value. So I will look at mentions at certain times with the hope that you can have a little bit of fun or maybe provide a little bit of perspective. But the wallowing, let me just tell everybody, full disclosure, officials make mistakes in games. And that becomes the topic of focus from our fan base. By the way, coaches and participants make mistakes. And so you end up in this blame game. And that's where I think the difficulty in figuring out how do we use social media as a resource has to continually be reconsidered.
Breaking news. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Make mistakes. All right, a few personal questions before we let you get out of here. And I think you may have already tipped your hand on this first one, but I was going to ask you, what's been the most impactful habit that you've quit or started during the course of the pandemic?
Well, I really had to pivot. So I was pretty intentional about exercise and reading pre-pandemic, but it was an early morning schedule. It was a morning ritual. Alarm went off at 4:40 a.m. and you're like, why would you not wake up at 4:30? Because philosophically, I believe the last 10 minutes of sleep is the most important 10 minutes of sleep. And I had it down to wake up at 4:40 and I was in the gym at 5:15. I would engage in functional fitness, as it's now known, workout, pull-ups, weightlifting, running, just a mix, clean up. And then I'd go to a Starbucks and I'd read for about 45 minutes. And I was regular. And that set me up for the day. I had a win in exercise. And then I had kind of a mental break of learning, and it may be work reading or personal reading. And that went away because I couldn't go to the gym in March 2020, and I couldn't go sit in a Starbucks in March 2020 and read. And after about 5 days of not doing anything, I'm like, this is not good for me. And I just compelled myself to go for a run at the beginning of the day. It started whenever I could grab time and has become beginning of the day for 35 minutes. Didn't care about distance, didn't care about pace, just continual movement. And that gave me that win back, and that's produced this streak. The parameters when I started, if anybody wants to start, was I go run 35 minutes without stopping except for traffic. You couldn't just run through traffic if you had to cross the street. And then don't miss 2 consecutive days. That was it. Didn't worry about distance, speed, time of day. And then after about a month, I'm like, well, I've run for a week without missing a day. I wonder if I could make it 2. And here we are 400 something days later. And then the reading part, which was really important for me for continual learning, moved to the end of my day. And what I found is this whole remote work thing, you could just be consumed in your home office from morning to night, no commuting, but you needed to draw kind of a boundary line. And so my boundary line became reading at the end of the day. So those 2 adjustments were really important for me, and provided kind of a not just the physical well-being, but some mental well-being as well.
I wanted to ask you about reading as well. You often tweet excerpts from the books that you're reading. You've already mentioned a couple of impactful books earlier in our conversation. Perhaps share 2 or 3 books with us that you've really enjoyed over the course of the last couple of years, or that you've learned a lot from.
Maybe 2 answers there. One is when we were going through the time in the summer of do we try to play football or not, actually 2 people, Gary Danielson, who's on CBS on our broadcast, and Jim Delaney, the former commissioner of the Big Ten. I had asked just dozens of people, why do we play college football? And if they said money or TV, I said, well, I want 5 reasons, and those 2 can't count. Both of them were quick to say, In 2019, we celebrated the 150th anniversary of college football. Will there be 151st? And you're wondering, like, how's this going to help me understand what books you read? But I had read a series of books starting really in January of 2020, a book called How Churchill Waged War. I referenced the book about the Navy SEAL team leader, a guy named Jocko Willink. I read a book in June by John M. Barry about the Spanish flu pandemic in 1917 and 1918. And right at the beginning of the year, I had finished a book called Leadership in Turbulent Times by Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote, Team of Rivals. And that book was about Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson, how they led in times of trouble. And those times of trouble were obviously the Civil War, but you had the difficulties socially, economically around Teddy Roosevelt, really his personal life, but Franklin Roosevelt economically, and then Lyndon Johnson socially, civil unrest, civil rights era. And you put all of those things together and realize for 150 years, we played football, began in 1869. We played through 2 world wars. We played through arguably 5 pandemics, depending on how you wanted to evaluate public health issues. We played through economic crisis, the Great Depression. Maybe we didn't play a full season in all of those experiences, but we played some kind of college football. We walked through social unrest with our student athletes. We walked through the economic realities of, you take the 70s and gas rationing and lines and rampant inflation. And yet we still played college football. That reading was really informative to, well, we can do really hard things in trying to play college sports. Will we be allowed to? And that informed trying. So in the last year, the learning experiences from that set of books in a really timely way helped me think through, can we play or can we try to play college football, which really preceded the should we try to play college football. And again, those learning experiences were enormously important for me. And I referenced another one, Thinking in Bets, that I think I read back in 2018. And there are any number of others I could bore you with. But what that observation, or what I learned from that book, was the observation that people like to think of leadership as these strategic moves on a chessboard. And the author's perspective was really, you're trying to make the best informed decision. But just like playing poker, you're not going to have complete information. You're going to have to eventually make a judgment. And that was a really helpful learning experiences, particularly as I had to communicate in advance about decisions and what information would be used to make those decisions.
Excellent. We will add those to the list. And if you're not already following the commissioner on Twitter, you should do so. He regularly tweets out great book recommendations. So recommend him as a follow. And also, if you need to add him after the result of a college football game on Saturday, you've already heard how he uses that data to inform his decision making. So final question before we let you get out of here. We know you have a really difficult job. It's been extra strenuous in the past year, but what's the single best or most rewarding part of the job you do?
I walked over at championship games this year, championship events, and I pursued opportunities. I couldn't do it with everyone, to say thank you for trying. Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for being part of the Southeastern Conference. And for this year, over and over, as I was trying to say thank you to student athletes or to coaches, they would typically say thank you first to me for giving them the opportunity. And I think that experience underscored the importance beyond scoreboards, beyond trophies and championships and coaches' contracts and ticket sales and TV ratings. The experience we provide is enormously important. The attachment to a community is central to what we do. And that's based in an educational setting. Even though we're challenged in communicating that, as I described earlier, those thank yous were about, hey, if we hadn't tried, time passes. And once time passes, you don't ever get it back. And so the effort to try meant a lot to those who are involved in the SEC. For me this year, those have been the most meaningful experiences.
Awesome. Well, let me, on behalf of our 14-member institutions and the SECCA audience, say thank you for your continued leadership, for your graciousness with your time to engage with our group today. I know it's been extremely insightful and valuable for us. And again, we just appreciate your willingness to gather with us today.
No, I appreciate the conversation. And as I just described, thank you for your work. Thanks to all of you who, didn't sign up for many of the things you had to deal with, just like all of us in the SEC office over the last 15 or 16 months. But we're here. We're certainly hopeful we're emerging from this pandemic reality to get back to the really the joy and the achievement to which we become accustomed. And you're an enormous part of how we succeed, but also how we present those achievements in a real way to the world outside our campuses. So thank you for your work.
Excellent. That's SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey, and the SECCA programming will continue this afternoon. Refer to your agenda or the SECCA website for this afternoon's sessions. We look forward to engaging with you further a little bit later today.